Si Jesus ang central figure ng Christianity. Marami sa kanyang mga aral at katangian ay kaparehas ng maraming mythological characters sa iba't ibang kultura at paniniwala. Isa na dito si Dionysus at sa video na ito ipapakita ko sa inyo ang mga pagkakatulad ni Jesus Christ the Son of God sa Bible at ni Dionysus the God of Wine, Pleasure and the Greek God of Fertility. Number 1. Si Jesus at Dionysus ay parehong gumagawa ng mga milagro. Sabi sa Bible na nagpapagaling si Jesus ng mga taong may sakit at nagbubuhay ng mga patay. Habang si Dionysus naman ay kaya ding mag-resurrect ng mga taong pumanaw na. Number 2. Immaculate Conception. Si Dionysus ay anak ni Zeus at Semele, isang taong virgin. Nabuo si Dionysus nung binisita ni Zeus si Semele in a form of an eagle. Dine described si Dionysus sa mythology as the only begotten son of God. Pamilyar ba? Ipapalala ko din sa inyo na si Jesus ay anak ng Diyos sa isang virgin na babae, si Mary. Nabuo si Jesus nang bumisita ng Diyos si Mary as a form of a dove. Si Zeus as a form of eagle. Sa Gospel ni Juan, inilalarawan ng tinapay at alak bilang tunay na pagkain at tunay na inumin, ang laman at dugo ni Jesus, na nangangako ng buhay na walang hanggan. Ang mga salitang Griego na ginamit ni Juan ay katulad ng mga salita sa Dabakay patungkol kay Dionysus. Number 5. Pareho silang laborators o nagpapalaya. Si Jesus ay nagtuturo ng mensahe na magpapalaya sa mga tao sa kanilang mga kasalanan. Habang si Dionysus naman ay nauugnay sa pagpapalaya sa mga tao sa kanilang mga societal constraints. Number 6. Pareho silang may kinalaman sa resurrection. Sinasabi ng iilan na si Jesus daw ay nabuhay 3 araw pagkatapos niyang mamatay, habang si Dionysus naman ay bumalik sa underworld at nabuhay muli at ito ang sumisimbolo sa cycle of life, death and rebirth. Number 7. Pareho silang anak ng Diyos. Si Jesus daw ay anak ng Diyos at si Dionysus naman ay ganoon din. Anak siya ni Zeus sa Greek mythology. Number 8. Pareho silang inuusig ng mga awtoridad. Si Jesus ay inaresto at pinatay ng mga Roman authorities. Pinako sa krus at namatay. Habang si Dionysus ay palaging inuusig ng mga conservative forces at minsan nang kinulong ni Pentheus, king of Thebes. Number 9. Pareho silang nakikita ng mga tao as saviors. Pinaniniwalaas ng mga Kristiyano na si Jesus ay ang anak ng Diyos at ang tagapagtanggol ng sangkatauhan at ganun din ang tingin kay Dionysus. Dionysus was seen as a savior na kayang dalhin ang mga tao sa isang higher state of consciousness. Number 10. Pareho silang may kaugnayan sa sacrifice. Ang kamatay ng Jesus sa krus ay nakikita ng ilang Kristiyano as a form of sacrifice para sa kasalanan ng mga tao, habang si Dionysus naman ay madalas ding inilalarawan as a sacrificial victim sa Greek mythology. Number 11. Pareho silang pinaniniwalaan na may kapangyarihan para baguhin ang mga buhay ng tao. Sinasabi nila na si Jesus daw ay kayang iligtas ang mga tao sa habang buhay na parusa sa impyerno, habang si Dionysus naman ay pinaniniwalaang kayang makapag-transform ng mga tao into a new state of being. Number 12. Pareho silang inuugnay sa idea ng divine madness dahil ang pagtuturo ng Jesus ay sinasabi ng ilan na masyado radical at unconventional at ganoon din kay Dionysus. Number 13. Visual similarities. Si Dionysus at si Jesus at parehong inilalarawan na may mahabang buhok at may kaugnayan sa purple cloak at crown of thorns. The crown of thorns was the signature way of identifying Dionysus and his disciples and is a symbol associated with the crucifixion of Christ. In conclusion, maraming pagkakatulad si Dionysus at si Jesus Christ. Pareho silang nauugnay sa alak at sa konsepto ng pagbabago sa pamamagitan ng ritual na pagkonsumo, at pareho rin silang mga tagapagligtas na nagbibigay ng pangako ng walang hanggang buhay sa kanilang mga tagasunod. Bukod pa rito, sila ay pawang binibigyang buhay bilang mga rebelde laban sa katamtamang kaalaman at kapangyarihan ng mga awtoridad. Ang mga pagkakatulad na ito ay nagpapakita ng paraan kung paano naghahanap ang mga tao sa iba't ibang kultura at panahon ng kahulugan at pagpapahayag ng kabanalan. At nagpapakita ng mga tema at motibo na nagpapahayag sa ating pinagsasamang karanasan bilang tao. Sa pamamagitan ng pagsusuri ng mga pagkakatulad sa pagitan ni Jesus at Dionysus, maaari tayong magkaroon ng mas malalim na pag-unawa sa iba't ibang paraan kung paano hinaharap ng tao ang mga tanong tungkol sa kahulugan, layunin, at pagpapataas sa buong kasaysayan. Ito na ang katapusan ng video. Maraming salamat sa lahat ng mga sumusuporta at hanggang sa muli. Stay skeptical.
There's been many religions before Christianity.
Yes.
And they all had the same story as Jesus. There was the son of God, his name was Kronos, it started with K. Yeah, and it was way before Jesus was born.
Okay.
And he died 3 days later, resurrected. Mm-hmm. And he was born on December 25th. And I was just telling my friend, I was like, okay, what's your point? And he was like, bro, like all this stuff happened way before Jesus. So yeah.
First of all, let me say this. When somebody says something, it's not your job to refute what they say. It's their job to support what they say. So when he says all this stuff is true about Mithras, first question you want to ask is, what do you mean by that? Okay? Because you need clarification.
Right.
The second question is, how did you come to that conclusion? In other words, what evidence do you have for this being true? Because searching the internet doesn't necessarily give you the right evidence. There's a lot of misinformation out there, okay?
Right.
And then the third question is, have you ever considered, and then you provide some evidence back to that person after they try to affirm their own view. And what I would say to somebody who said that Mithras was someone who predated Jesus, and therefore you're saying that what, Jesus borrowed, the New Testament writers borrowed from it, and they invented it? Here's the truth about Mithras. Number one, it's too late to influence Christianity because it's after Christianity. It's not before. If anybody took anything from anybody, it was Mithras taking it from Christianity, not the other way around. Secondly, he was born out of a rock, not a virgin. Thirdly, he was said to be a god, not a teacher. He didn't have 12 disciples. Number four, he didn't sacrifice himself. He sacrificed a bull. And finally, we don't know anything about his death. There was no resurrection. So just because some website somewhere says all this stuff doesn't mean it's true.
Okay. But Egypt is older than, the hieroglyphics in... Oh, my bad. The hieroglyphics in Egypt is older.
Yes. Oh, yeah. There's people that predated Jesus. We know that. There were religions prior to Jesus. But even if there were similarities, that doesn't mean that one copied from another. In fact, let me ask you guys this. Tell me what ship this was. There was a ship that went on its maiden voyage from Europe that came across the Atlantic. It didn't have enough lifeboats on it. It happened about a century ago. It hit an iceberg.
Titanic.
It sank, and a lot of people died. That ship was false. It's not what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of a ship called The Futility, which was a novel written in 1898 with the exact same or many of the same details that occurred to the Titanic 14 years later.
Wow.
Now, no one's going to say because The Futility, a fictional novel, was written 14 years before the Titanic, that all news reports of the Titanic must be false. They must be borrowed from this novel, right? So just because there's similarities, if there are, doesn't mean that one is borrowed from another. Make sense?
Gotcha.
All right, thanks, George. And by the way, this is... No, I got you. I'm done. I'm good. I'm just going to mention one other thing, and that is these questions are very important. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? Have you ever considered? They're all from Greg Koukos' book, Tactics. If you haven't read that book, you need to read it. They're also in our app, the CrossExamined app, 2 words in the App Store. So you should always ask those questions. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? Have you ever considered? Now, ladies and gentlemen, these questions you can use for anything, not just questions about Christianity or anything else. Like parents, if your son calls you one night and says, Dad, I'm not going to be home by 11 like you wanted me to, don't panic. First question, what do you mean by that? Second question, how'd you come to that conclusion? Third question, have you ever considered if you're not home by 11, you're grounded for 2 weeks? Be right home, Dad. Right? By the way, husbands, never, ever, ever use these questions on your wives.
Right.
Because if she calls you an idiot, don't say, what do you mean by that? Or, how did you come to that conclusion? She's going to have a list 25 years long, and you are toast. All right? Thank you, George. Thank you.
Was Jesus based on the Greek god Dionysus? Many mysticists think Jesus never existed and was just a copy of the god Dionysus, because Dionysus was born of a virgin on December 25th. He was a traveling teacher who performed miracles. He was called Holy Child and placed in a manger. He turned water into wine and was known as God of the Vine. He rode in a triumphant procession on a donkey. He was a king that was ritually killed and eaten in a Eucharistic ritual. He rose from the dead on March 25th. He was depicted as being hung on a tree or crucified. He was called King of Kings, God of Gods, Begotten Son, Savior, Redeemer, Anointed One, and the Alpha and Omega. And he has the same trial as Jesus. So do we have proof Jesus was just a mythic copy of the god Dionysus? Well, for that to be true, some of these claims would have to be correct, but most of them are simply wrong. First, Dionysus was not born on December 25th, or even of a virgin. One legend says he was a son of Zeus and Persephone. Another says he was born to Semele after he was impregnated by Zeus, who took the form of a lightning bolt. Hera became jealous and killed her. However, the prenatal form of Dionysus remained. Zeus took him and sewed him into his thigh until he was ready to be born. This is nothing like what happened to Jesus. There is also no reference to him being born on December 25th. This was just made up out of thin air. This next one is true, but it is universal truth for any divine religious teacher. There is no evidence Dionysus was ever called Holy Child or placed in a manger. This is also just made up out of thin air. He did turn water into wine, but this account comes from Achilles Tatius, whose work is much later than the Book of John. And scholars say it is more likely the pagans were parroting the Eucharist of the Christians. As for being called God of the Vine, this was actually never said of Jesus. Jesus called himself a vine to make a point about growing spiritually in him, which had nothing to do with wine or calling himself the god of the grapevine. Dionysus is depicted riding a mule, while crowds are waving ivy branches, mainly because this is how the ancient Greco-Roman culture treated kingly figures. If a triumphant king was entering your city, this was the customary way to greet him, and it was done for Roman emperors, generals, and religious figures. So this was done quite often in the ancient world, and is way too general to force any type of parallel. The next one is not true, and seems to be taken from a misunderstood story of Dionysus. One legend Diodorus reports is that Dionysus was taken by Titans when he was a child, and they boiled and ate him. Zeus found out and killed the Titans and restored him back to life from the heart that was left over. There is no evidence this was ever done ritually by human followers of Dionysus. I can find no evidence Dionysus rose from the dead, let alone on March 25th, and no evidence he was depicted as hung on a tree or crucified. This supposed depiction of him is a late forgery from the early 20th century. There is no evidence he was called King of Kings, God of Gods, Begotten Son, or any of these other titles that are applied to Christ. Finally, anyone can read the trial of Dionysus and the Bacchae and see the trial is nothing like what happened to Jesus, despite what freaking Gandhi say. Dionysus was put on trial for making women go mad. He lets himself be taken so he can publicly humiliate King Pentheus. He then escapes from prison by an earthquake and has the women kill Pentheus. Dionysus is also described in homoerotic terms. This is nothing like the trial of Jesus. The only similarity seems to be that they were both on trial, which is far too general to form any parallel. So as you can see, the only parallels that are remotely true are far too general to form any connection. So that means there is no evidence Jesus was just a myth based on Dionysus.